She kept the house. She kept the savings account. She kept the life insurance payout, all for $20,000 of it. And when everything was divided up and signed over, my daughter-in-law handed me a single cardboard box with my son's name written on the side in black marker, smiled like she was doing me a favor, and said, "I thought you might want something to remember him by." Inside was a baseball glove from when he was 9 years old, a broken watch, and his truck keys. That was it. That was my inheritance from 31 years of raising the best man I ever knew. My name is Roy. I'm 64 years old. I worked 38 years at a paper mill in Kingsport, Tennessee, and I have spent every single day of the past 4 months trying to understand how I ended up here, sitting in my late son's pickup truck in the parking lot of a funeral home, holding a set of keys that didn't seem to belong to anyone anymore, wondering if any of it had meant anything at all. Let me back up. My son's name was Elliot. He was 33 years old when he died, or at least that's what I believed for 3 weeks. He had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and from the time he was old enough to hold a fishing pole, we were close. Not in the way some fathers and sons are close, where they just happen to live nearby and show up at the same holidays. I mean, close like we talked every Sunday without fail. Like he called me from the hospital parking lot before his wife went into surgery just because he needed to hear a steady voice. Close like that. He met Vanessa about 6 years ago. She was pretty and sharp and laughed at all his jokes. And at first I was glad for him. A man needs somebody. I know that better than most. I lost my wife, Elliot's mother, when he was only 15. It was just the two of us for a long time after that, and watching him find someone made something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for years. But I noticed things. Small things at first. The way she'd go quiet whenever Elliot and I talked about something that didn't include her. The way she started suggesting he didn't need to call me every Sunday. "You're grown men, Roy. You don't need to check in like teenagers." She said it once, laughing, like it was a joke, but Elliot's calls started getting shorter after that, then less frequent. By last spring, we were down to twice a month. I told myself it was normal. Marriages take time. People get busy. I didn't want to be the father-in-law who made trouble. Then Elliot died. He was driving home from a job site on a Thursday evening in October. His truck went off Route 70, over an embankment, into the creek below. The truck caught fire. There was no body recovered. The investigators said the water and the fire had. They used clinical words I couldn't hold in my head. I sat in a sheriff's office and I heard the words, and none of them made sense. They held a memorial service 8 days later. A closed casket, obviously. The funeral home director was kind. Vanessa wore black and accepted condolences with the practice calm of someone who had already moved on in her mind, though I didn't understand that yet. I sat in the front row and I kept looking at that casket and thinking, he's not in there, he can't be in there, and I told myself that was just grief talking, that grief makes you irrational, that I needed to let him go. The will was read at the house 2 weeks after the service. I found out that morning it was happening. Vanessa called me at 8 a.m. and said to be there by 10 if I wanted to be present. Elliot's attorney, a quiet man named Sutherland, read through the document in a flat voice while Vanessa sat across from me with her hands folded. Elliot had left everything to his wife. The house. The savings. The life insurance policy he'd taken out 3 years ago. Vanessa got all of it. There was one line at the bottom of the document that mentioned me. His personal effects and his truck were to go to his father, Roy Caldwell. That's me? Sutherland looked up over his glasses when he read that part. I think he expected me to say something. I didn't. I just nodded. Vanessa gave me the box and the keys in the driveway. She didn't invite me inside. She said she'd been through a lot, and she needed space to heal, and I said I understood. And I drove the truck home because my car was still at my house, where I'd left it when I'd gotten a ride over that morning. I didn't look at the truck closely for almost a week. I'd park it in the driveway and go inside and make dinner and sit in the chair by the window where I've sat since 1987, and I'd just exist. That's the only word for it. I wasn't living, I was existing. Breathing in, breathing out. Waiting for something, though I couldn't have told you what. On the 7th day, I went out to move the truck so I could get my lawnmower out of the garage. I climbed up into the cab and the smell hit me first. Motor oil and the specific cedar air freshener Elliot always bought at the truck stop on 23, the same kind he'd used since he was 19. I sat there for a minute with my hands on the wheel, and I was not okay. When I finally got myself together enough to turn the ignition, the dashboard lit up. The radio came on low, and the GPS screen flickered to life. There was a destination already entered. I almost didn't think anything of it. People leave addresses in their GPS all the time. It was probably a job site, or a hardware store, or somewhere completely ordinary. I reached over to clear it, and I stopped. The label on the saved destination wasn't an address. It was a name. It said, "For Dad, when you're ready." I sat very still for a long time. My first thought was that I was imagining it. That grief does things to your eyes, makes you see what you want to see. So I looked again. I looked at it for a solid minute. "For Dad, when you're ready." My hands were shaking when I put the truck in reverse. The coordinates led me out of Kingsport, south on 23, then off onto a county road I'd never taken, then down a gravel path through a stretch of eastern Tennessee hill country that I didn't know at all. It was mid-November. The trees had mostly given up their leaves. The light was flat and gray, and the GPS kept telling me to continue for another 6 miles, then 4, then 2. I almost turned back twice. What was I doing? Following a dead man's GPS down a gravel road? It was the grief. It was wishful thinking. I was a 63-year-old widower who had just lost his only son, and I was chasing a ghost through the hill country like something out of a story someone tells to explain why old people shouldn't live alone. But I didn't turn back. The road ended at a gate, old wooden gate, the kind you lift and swing, not locked, with a mailbox on a post next to it. The mailbox had no name on it, just a number, 4411. Beyond the gate was a narrow dirt track through some pines, and at the end of that track, maybe a quarter mile in, I could see a structure. Small, a cabin or something like it. I got out and opened the gate. I drove through. I parked in front of the cabin and I sat there looking at it. The lights were on inside. I'm going to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, because I think people who tell these stories sometimes smooth out the parts that don't make sense, and I don't want to do that. What I felt was not hope. Hope felt too dangerous. What I felt was something older and quieter than hope, a recognition almost. Like some part of me that had been clenched for 3 weeks was starting, very slowly, to loosen. I knocked on the door. The man who opened it looked like my son. Thinner, unshaven, a cut on his forehead that was mostly healed. But it was him. It was Elliot. He was standing in the doorway of a cabin in the Tennessee hill country, alive, looking at me with the most complicated expression I have ever seen on another human face. I don't remember exactly what I said. I think it was something like, "What in the world?" which is not particularly eloquent, but it was all I had. He said, "Hi, Dad." And then my son held the door open, and I went inside. We sat at a small table with 2 chairs that barely fit in the kitchen of that cabin, and he told me everything. He'd been planning it for 8 months. 8 months of quietly, carefully building a second life while appearing to live the first one. He had a reason, and when he explained it, I understood, though I'm not sure understanding made it easier. Elliot had discovered, about a year before his death, that Vanessa was working with her brother to drain his business accounts. He was a partner in a small electrical contracting firm, and Vanessa had gotten access to the company's secondary accounts through a bookkeeping arrangement she'd insisted on setting up. He found discrepancies first. Then he found invoices. Then, when he went to a private attorney on his own, not Sutherland, someone else, a woman named Beaumont up in Bristol, he found out just how much had been moved. More than that, though, he'd found something that scared him. Among the emails Beaumont helped him pull together, there were messages between Vanessa and her brother, discussing what would happen if Elliot became a problem. They didn't spell it out clearly, but they didn't have to. Elliot was afraid for his life, and he was afraid that if he came to me, he'd put me in danger too. So he built an exit. He spent 8 months documenting everything, the theft, the emails, the financial trail, and handing it off quietly to a contact at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. He arranged the accident with the help of his business partner, a man named Doug, who was also being defrauded and had just as much reason to want the truth out. The truck was Doug's secondary vehicle, older, insured separately. The GPS message was entered months in advance. Elliot had planned to wait until the investigation was far enough along before leading me to the cabin. 3 weeks, he said. He needed 3 weeks. I listened to all of this without interrupting. When he was done, the cabin was very quiet. Outside, the wind was moving through the pines. I said, 3 weeks, Elliot. He looked down at the table. I know. I sat at that casket. I sat at that casket and I didn't know. I know, Dad. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. There was no version of this that didn't hurt you, and I picked the one that I thought kept you safest. I don't know if that was right. I've been asking myself that every day. There's not a clean answer to that. I want to be honest about that too. I was angry. I stayed angry for a while. Even after the relief, even after I understood the reasons, grief that turns out to be unnecessary doesn't just dissolve, it leaves a residue. But Elliot was alive, and he was sitting across from me at a small table in a pine cabin in the hills, and he was my son, and eventually, the anger had somewhere to go. He showed me the documentation, binders of it, organized with a precision that made me think of his mother, who was the most thorough person I ever knew. The TBI case was already open. Beaumont was coordinating with them. Vanessa and her brother, whose name was Scott, were under active investigation for wire fraud, embezzlement, and the charge that made my blood run cold to read: conspiracy to commit harm. Elliot moved back into legal existence slowly, with the help of Beaumont and the investigators. These things take time, and they take paperwork, and they involve more phone calls than any sane person would believe. By February, he had filed the documentation to have his death certificate challenged. By March, Vanessa had been arrested. Scott was arrested 2 weeks later in Chattanooga. The case was still moving through the courts when I started putting this all down. But the outcome, the real outcome, the one that mattered, had already arrived by then. My son was alive. Let me tell you what the day was like when he drove back into Kingsport for the first time. It was a Tuesday, which is not a dramatic day for a thing like this, but it was a Tuesday, and the sky was that particular East Tennessee blue that happens in late winter when the cold is starting to break. Elliot pulled up in a rental. Doug's old truck had served its purpose, and he got out and stood in my driveway, and I came out onto the porch, and we just looked at each other for a moment. Then I went down the porch steps, and I hugged my son, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Doug was there too, in his own truck around the corner. He'd been part of this from early on, and I'd met him once at the cabin, and found him to be the kind of quiet, decent man that you're glad exists in the world. He gave me a nod when I saw him, and I nodded back, and that was sufficient. Vanessa's trial was set for the following fall. I didn't attend, my attorney. I had gotten my own by then, a local man named Bird who'd handled property cases for years and turned out to know his way around civil proceedings too, told me the civil case for recovery of the life insurance proceeds was on solid ground. The insurance company had already opened its own fraud investigation. These things resolve, eventually. Money moves slowly through courts, but it moves. What I want to say, what I've been circling around because I'm not sure I have the right words, is this: there's a particular kind of darkness that comes when you lose a child. I don't care how old they are, 33, or 3, or any number in between. When a parent buries a child, something changes in the basic texture of the world. Light comes in differently. Sound has a different quality. You go through the motions of living because that's what you do. But there's a part of you that is simply standing in the parking lot of a funeral home holding a set of keys, not sure where to go next. I stood in that parking lot for 3 weeks, and then a truck GPS led me down a gravel road in the hill country, and I knocked on a door and my son opened it. I've thought a lot about why Elliot didn't find another way, why he couldn't just come to me or go to the police directly or leave Vanessa and deal with the fallout. He's explained it, and the explanation makes sense and I believe him. But I've also come to understand that the explanation isn't really the point. The point is that he trusted me to find him. He saves us coordinates and he labeled them, "For Dad, when you're ready." And he trusted that I would get in that truck eventually and that I would follow it to where he was. He knew me. Even from 8 months of careful, frightening planning, he knew his father would get in the truck. I think about that more than anything else when I sit in the chair by the window these evenings. Not the fraud, not the trial, not the things Vanessa said through her attorney that were not worth the paper they were printed on. I think about a man who was scared and cornered and doing his best, and who, in the middle of all of it, found time to enter a GPS coordinate and write his father's name on it. Elliot is living about 20 minutes from me now. He's working with Doug again. The contracting firm is smaller than it was, but it's honest and it's his. He comes over on Sundays. We go fishing up at Watauga Lake when the season allows. We don't talk about the 3 weeks very often, but it's there between us, not as a wound exactly, more like a scar that tells you something healed. I turned 64 this March. Elliot made a cake. It was lopsided, and the frosting was more or less everywhere, and it was the best cake I've ever eaten. If you're listening to this, and you have someone you've been meaning to call, a son, a daughter, a father, someone, don't wait. Don't let distance become habit. Don't let silence become comfortable when it isn't. I almost lost my son to a woman who wanted his money and a grief that wasn't real. And the thing that brought him back was a GPS coordinate and the fact that we'd spent 33 years building something between us that was strong enough to survive 3 weeks of the worst silence I've ever known. The truck is still in my driveway. I drive it sometimes. It still smells like cedar. Drop your location in the comments and let me know. Has there ever been a moment when something ordinary, something you almost didn't notice, turned out to change everything? I'd like to hear it. And if the story meant something to you, pass it along. You never know who needs it. I've been sitting with this story for a long time before I figured out what it actually taught me. Not what I wanted it to teach me. What it actually did. The easy version is that Vanessa got what she deserved, and Elliot came home and everything worked out. That version is true, as far as it goes. But it leaves out the part that keeps me up some nights. The part where I asked myself what would have happened if I'd never gotten in that truck. If I'd sold it. If I'd cleared the GPS without looking. If I'd been the kind of man who doesn't follow things through. That's the real question under all of this. And I think it's worth saying plainly, the outcome of this story had almost nothing to do with luck. It had everything to do with choices. Long, slow, quiet choices that both Elliot and I made over decades without knowing we were making them. Elliot chose to document everything instead of panicking. He chose patience when every instinct probably screamed at him to run. He chose to trust that the truth, laid out carefully and completely, would be more powerful than a lie that had a head start. That's not something you decide in a crisis. That's something you build in yourself over years. The understanding that how you respond to a hard situation matters more than the situation itself. Elliot had that. I'd like to think some of it came from watching me handle things over the years. But honestly, a lot of it was just him. He was always steadier than me. And Vanessa, I've thought about her too, more than I expected to. What she did came from somewhere. Greed doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows in people who decide, at some point, that they are owed more than what honesty will get them. That's a choice too, made gradually, rationalized piece by piece, until the person making it can no longer see what they've become. The fraud didn't start with the wire transfers. It started with a smaller decision to take something that wasn't hers and tell herself it was fine, and then the next one, and then the next. That's how people end up in handcuffs, not in a single dramatic moment, but at the end of a long road of small surrenders to the worst part of themselves. What I know, at 64, is that integrity is not a feeling. It's a practice. It's what you do when nobody is watching and there's no immediate consequence either way. Elliot practiced it. Doug practiced it. Even that attorney, Beaumont, who could have turned down a complicated case, she practiced it. And every one of those small, private choices accumulated to something that was eventually strong enough to hold up against a fraud that had been built over years. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a retired paper mill worker from Kingsport who drives his son's truck and goes fishing on the weekends. But I've lived long enough to see that the people who end up okay, not rich, not famous, just okay, which is really what most of us want, are the ones who kept doing the right thing even when it was harder and slower and less immediately satisfying than the alternative. The truck is still in my driveway. I drive it on Sundays when Elliot comes over. Every time I turn the ignition and the GPS lights up, I think about the man who entered those coordinates and trusted his father to find them. He knew me well enough to know I would. I hope I've spent the rest of the time since then being worth that kind of trust.